So if you've been on the internet recently, you've likely seen a whole lot about Elon Musk, the world's richest man, CEO of Tesla, founder of SpaceX, and soon to be owner of Twitter, among other things. But it's that last one which we'll be focusing on today though, and it's the thing which has caused the biggest stir recently. So let's explain what's happened, and then discuss why the world's richest man would want to buy one of the world's least profitable social media platforms. Before we start, we've been reporting on this story for a while over on the Daily Briefing, which is our show where we run through the 5 most important news stories each and every day, giving you a rundown of everything you need to know from around the world in just a matter of minutes. You can watch over on the separate TLDR Daily YouTube channel, or listen along by searching in your favourite podcast app. Now, some of you might be surprised with how I just described Twitter in the introduction of this video. One of the world's least profitable social media platforms. That might sound harsh, but it's certainly not untrue. Despite shaping the media cycle and getting a whole load of attention, both good and bad, the site doesn't actually have that many monthly active users. 436 million might sound impressive, but when you compare that to Facebook at nearly 3 billion or YouTube's 2.6 billion, it begins to look a little less impressive. Sure, both of those are behemoths, so maybe it's an unfair comparison. But WhatsApp, Instagram, WeChat, TikTok, Messenger, Douyin, QQ, Weibo, Cashew, Snapchat, Telegram, and Pinterest all have more active monthly users, despite my inability to pronounce 3 of them properly. But it's Twitter's profits where the real issues emerge. The site might be getting a pretty good audience. 436 million people certainly isn't anything to be sniffed at, but monetization is their real problem. Since 2010, the company has had a net income for just 2 years, 2018 and 2019, with their worst year, 2020, seeing a net loss of over $1 billion. Compare that to Meta, Facebook's parent company, who have seen their income soar to nearly $40 billion a year, and things just don't look so healthy for Twitter in comparison. In fact, investors have been cautious of the platform for a while now, with Twitter stock falling hard towards the end of the last decade, and then again more recently. That was until speculation about Musk began. Speaking of which, it was earlier this month that Musk first announced his stake within the business, announcing that he'd amassed 9.2% of the company on April 4th. There was then some back and forth over the potential of him joining Twitter's board, but ultimately he opted against joining, and that was potentially when he realized that doing so would limit his maximum stake in the business to 14.9%, blocking any sort of takeover. Instead, on April 14th, Musk offered to buy the entire company outright, taking the business private and valuing it at $54.20 a share, or $44 billion. An offer that he described as his best and final offer. Now, Musk might be the richest man in the world, worth an estimated $264.6 billion, but that's still a huge chunk of cash to pay for Twitter, about 1/6 of his total value. So some did question whether he'd actually be able to pull it together and get all the required funding that he would need, especially considering that he's been loose with promises like this before, getting himself in trouble when he claimed that funding was secured to take Tesla private even when he didn't have that funding. I say he got in trouble, but they settled for a $40 million payout in return for this lie, which is certainly more trouble than I've ever been in. Regardless, this issue of securing funding is more important than you might think. Sure, he's worth more than $250 billion on paper, but that doesn't mean he's got the money sitting around waiting to spend. Now, we don't need to start a GoFundMe for Elon or anything. He's got a good amount of cash, I'm sure. But valuations like this can be a little misleading. When you're looking at someone's net value, the valuation includes all kinds of things beyond just cash in bank accounts. This number also includes all kinds of intangible assets, like stocks and even their personal brand. After all, a lot of President Trump's personal valuation came down to the value of the Trump brand, rather than anything more tangible. And don't worry, we'll come back to Trump again in a moment. Anyway, this all means that Musk had to work out a way to find that money. After all, if he just decided to sell a bunch of shares in companies he owns, he could freak out investors and crash their values. So he has to act carefully. Now, Musk isn't known for his carefulness. So some were surprised last Thursday when he actually submitted a plan to fund the purchase, with him sending that over to his old rivals at the SEC. The plan had two major components: $25 billion in loans and $21 billion in personal equity. I said just a moment ago that Musk can't just sell his Tesla stock without damaging the company, but he can borrow against that stock. And that's exactly what he plans to do, with Morgan Stanley senior funding lending him over $25 billion, $13 billion in debt financing, and $12.5 billion in loans against Tesla stock. So now that Twitter is within Musk's grasp, it's worth considering what the hell is he doing. He's a seemingly fairly savvy, if occasionally irrational businessman. Love or loathe his personality, it seems like an odd business move to buy the ailing social network, especially considering that the takeover is pushing yet more loans on the company, set to cost at least $1 billion a year, crippling Twitter's finances yet harder. And yes, you heard that right. Twitter will be liable for the cost of some of the loans that were taken out in order to buy Twitter. Now, we don't have time to get into leveraged buyouts in this video, especially this one, which is one of the biggest in history. But essentially, when borrowing money to buy a business, you're able to borrow money based on the assets of the company you're buying. Essentially, you're using the business you plan to buy as collateral to buy itself before you pass those debts onto the new company. Now, these kinds of LBOs are pretty controversial and often end up going badly for the company being bought out. But this case is actually a little different. More than a normal LBO, Musk has a real incentive to make this work. Often, LBOs involve the purchaser putting down as little as 10% of the purchase value, but Musk has put a lot more on the line, both in the form of millions worth of personal capital, as well as potentially 152 million Tesla stocks. So it's perhaps a little surprising when many claim that he's not actually worried about Twitter's economic success, and isn't too concerned about turning around the company's fiscal fortunes. At least not right away. So if it's not about the money for Musk, then why is he sinking so much of it into Twitter? Well, fortunately for us, Musk has been reasonably open about his intentions, or at least his publicly stated reasoning. In fact, Musk took part in a, sorry Elon fans, pretty incoherent and hard to watch interview with the head of TED a week or so ago. Now, admittedly, much of the blame for that interview actually lands with the interviewer, not Musk. And there goes my chance of ever hosting a TED Talk. But that isn't the only thing we have to decipher his intentions. Musk also released a statement alongside the press release which announced his purchase of Twitter, where he stated that free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy, and Twitter is the digital town square where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated. I want to make Twitter better than ever by enhancing the product with new features, making the algorithms open source to increase trust, defeating the spam bots, and authenticating all humans. Now, these are things he's talked about before. Free speech has long been an issue that Musk has taken with Twitter, particularly berating the company for removing controversial figures, some of their fact-checking, and for allegedly shadow banning users. However, despite these core critiques, it's not exactly clear what philosophy Musk plans to take here. He's clearly a big fan of the First Amendment, but his backers often don't seem to understand the limitations of said amendment, or even how they actually apply to social networks. Furthermore, the company would have an even greater issue globally. Musk has said on numerous occasions that he thinks it should be governments making the rules, and that Twitter should just follow the rules of the countries where they operate. But it's just not that simple. The US might be proud of their First Amendment, but other countries act very differently. Take the world's biggest democracy, India. India doesn't have a right to speech with limited exceptions like the US. It has the reverse, which means running a platform open to both countries could be very difficult. In fact, Twitter has already had issues with countries like India, who forced them to have local offices for this exact reason, and where the ruling BJP party recently sent national police officers to their office over a dispute over Twitter's application of fact checks on party political tweets. And it's not just free speech that's an issue either. Twitter has long had problems with moderating and handling hate speech and misinformation. And throughout the chaotic TED Talk, it was made clear on a number of occasions that neither the interviewer or interviewee had a particularly clear grasp on the limits of both issues, with comparisons being made to the fire in a crowded theatre myth, an analogy used referring to a specific Supreme Court case which was never law in a case that was thrown out nearly 4 decades ago. In fact, The Atlantic has a good piece about it, which I've linked below. Regardless, some have speculated that his passion for free speech could drive Musk to bring Trump back to the platform, which would make some very happy and some less so. Beyond just free speech, though, the other promises made by Musk are also fairly vague and potentially troubling. He talks regularly about opening up the algorithm, and while that does bring its benefits, it's also far from clear how doing so would resolve many of his core complaints. I mean, if seeing inside the Twitter algorithm allows you to work out why you're supposedly being shadow banned, for instance, then you're probably the best computer scientist that's ever lived. Now, there is a case for some kind of why am I getting this tweet button in order to allow you to work out how the algorithm is working. It would be complex, but it might help. Certainly more than just opening up the algorithm. While opening it up would allow you to see which buttons and levers are being shifted to impact a tweet's reach, there'll be no way for you to then use that information to work out why an individual account or tweet behaves as it does, which is the core complaint here after all. Reducing spam and bots is also difficult. Musk clearly takes greatest issue with the bots that imitate him, especially in the crypto space. But differentiating these spam bots is difficult. I mean, if it was easy, they'd have done it years ago. And it's clearly just hard to tell the difference between useful bots, which do things like share news published by major outlets or the availability of COVID tests, from spam bots that you want to remove. Some will clearly be excited by Musk's vision of a more open and free speech Twitter, while others might worry what kind of world will emerge when even the rudimental guardrails Twitter has built are torn down. But if Elon's not worried about the economics of this all, then maybe it doesn't matter. If you don't like the new Twitter, I suppose you can leave. Your money's not really important to them anymore anyway. Elon has his latest plaything, and he'll take his ball and go home if you don't like it. Anyway, if you want to be updated on this story and how Elon and Twitter change in the weeks ahead, then be sure to check out the Daily Briefing. That's our new daily show where we explain 5 news stories every single day. We pick out the big stories, the ones you ought to know about, but we also choose some smaller ones that you might otherwise miss. So if you want to be better informed about the world around you and news from all over the globe, then you really ought to subscribe. And it's only a few minutes each day, so what do you have to lose? We post a video version every weekday over on the TLDR Daily channel, so you can subscribe over there. Or you can listen along to the podcast by searching for the TLDR Daily Briefing in your favourite podcast app. Thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy the new show.